Hi, Tori. So I read through your characterization piece, and I find this Matt character very interesting, but I think your attempts at drawing a contrast between his adventurous spirit and his professional side is a little underdeveloped because you focus much more on his adventurous spirit and his childhood than you do on what he's like now and what he's like in the office. And so I think to make him more of a dynamic character, you need to bring some more balance to the story. So one way I talked about in my written critique you could do that is by having more of a focus. When I read this, I feel like it kind of bounces around a little bit. You start out, he's talking about his baby, then suddenly he's talking about his childhood, and then you find out that he's going to be the chief, but then you're back to talking about the baby again. And so I feel like there's not necessarily a flow to it. So my advice would be to maybe hone in on the fact that he's going to become the chief, because that inherently shows that he at least has enough responsibility and he's professional enough to earn that kind of rank. And so I think that just on its own could help bring more balance because it's established in the reader's mind right away. This guy is someone important, so obviously he's very professional. Similarly, I think your point of view shifts around a little bit. I like the opening quote because it feels like dialogue, and it shows kind of his off-color personality through his own words. I want to name my baby Colt with a K. Well, that's a little unusual, so you find out that maybe Matt himself is a little unusual. And then from that dialogue, you move into your own personal narrative where you're the voice writing, and then suddenly we have Stan. And if I were you, I would just take Stan out because he doesn't show up again, at least in this piece. And so it's just kind of random and it's a bit distracting to include that quote. And the quote itself would be good, talking about how he's analytical. That would be a good way to bring more balance that I'm talking about, but you don't flesh that out. There are no details about Matt or any stories that you really provide to show that he's analytical. You go right into his childhood. And so I think if you're not going to back that up, I would just take it out because it's a little bit distracting. Similarly, your other quote from Matt saying, "I was definitely not an inside kid," I wouldn't use that as a quote, not a direct quote anyway, because it feels more like I'm reading a newspaper story than a piece of literary journalism. Like, it feels like that quote was obviously part of an interview and not a natural conversation. And so I think the content is good. It's good to hear him talking about his childhood and how he knew he was adventurous. But maybe use that as like an internal monologue where he's reflecting on his childhood and how it brought him to his career today. Something like that that's less obvious. I feel like those two quotes, this quote and Stan, are more tell than show. And so I think rephrasing them and not using them as direct quotes or even taking them out would lend itself more to showing rather than telling. So you also talk about, you make allusions to physical details about him, blonde hair, buzz cut. But the story in general is lacking, I think, the details and just the descriptions that it needs. You talk a lot about, or really you rely more on stories to develop the character, which is good. But I think that, we need to have those descriptions. I suggested in my written critique, what's he like in the fire station? Does he keep his area neat and tidy? Do people respect him? Is he a hard worker? Just those kind of interactions with his coworkers, I think, would add to the story and would give more balance to that professional side that you're trying to get at. And finally, I'd say you're focusing too much on the past. In this story, you devote several paragraphs to his how he showed signs of being adventurous and wanting to be a firefighter as a child. And that's good. I would include that, but it's the overwhelming majority of this piece. And I think the present should be the majority, not necessarily the past. So I think just trimming down that part, adding more description about who he is now, more concrete details that can show us who he is. But I do think Matt is an interesting character, so I'm looking forward to see where you go with this.